The door slammed so hard the framed photo of my late wife fell off the wall. I didn't pick it up right away. I just stood there in my own kitchen, 63 years old, holding a dish towel, listening to my son-in-law's truck back out of the driveway. The photo lay face down on the linoleum, Margaret's photo. 14 years gone, and I still told to her picture every morning. I picked it up. The glass wasn't broken. Small mercy. That was a Tuesday in October. 2 weeks before everything changed. My name is Clive Harmon. I spent 31 years working quality control at a paper mill outside of Boise, Idaho. Nothing glamorous. I wore steel-toed boots and drove a 9F-150, and my idea of a good weekend was fishing the Boise River with a thermos of bad coffee. Margaret and I raised our daughter Joanna in a 3-bedroom house on Crescent Hill Road that we paid off in 2004. The house wasn't fancy, but it was ours. It was paid for. And when Margaret passed, it became the one thing I had left that felt like her. Joanna was our only child, smart girl, stubborn like her mother. She married Fletcher Webb when she was 26. I remember standing next to her at the altar thinking, well, he's got a good handshake. I gave that man the benefit of the doubt for 8 years. I kept giving it right up until the moment he told me I was living in his house. His house. He said it with a straight face, standing in my kitchen. The kitchen where I taught Joanna to make pancakes. The kitchen where Margaret and I sat up late, talking after every hard day we ever had together. He stood there in his Under Armour pullover and said, "Clive, let's be honest. Joanna and I need space. This is our house now. You're a guest here." I said, "Fletcher, this house is in my name." He smiled. That thin little smile. For now. That was September. By October, the pressure had been building for 6 weeks straight. They moved in 18 months before all this happened. Joanna called it temporary. Fletcher had lost his job at the logistics company. Laid off, he said, though I later found out he'd been let go for reasons that had nothing to do with the layoff. They needed somewhere to stay while they got back on their feet. I said, of course. What father says no to his daughter? I converted the guest room. I moved my workshop stuff from the basement to the shed. I gave them space, gave them privacy, bought groceries, and didn't say a word about it. Fletcher found another job within 3 months. Good job, actually. Operations manager at a distribution center in Meridian. The money was decent, but they didn't move out. Joanna said it made more sense to save up. Fine. I'm not a monster. I understood. What I didn't understand was how a man who was saving up money could afford a new bass boat in April, or how my grocery bill doubled, while their savings apparently never materialized into an apartment deposit. Or how Fletcher started having opinions about my furniture. My living room furniture, in my living room, in my house. "Dad, that recliner is an eyesore," Joanna told me one evening. I'd had that recliner since 2009. I moved the recliner to my bedroom and said nothing. The first real moment, the moment I knew something was wrong in a way that went beyond rudeness, was a Sunday afternoon in August. I came home from church to find a man I didn't recognize walking through my basement with Fletcher. The man had a clipboard. He was measuring things. I said, "Fletcher, who is this?" Fletcher said, "Just a contractor friend, getting some ideas." Ideas for what? Finishing the basement, making better use of the space. I asked him if he was planning to pay for that. He looked at me the way you look at a child who's asked an embarrassing question in public. He said, "We'll talk about it later, Clive." We never did. In September, Joanna sat me down at the kitchen table with her hands folded like she was conducting a performance review. She said Fletcher and she had been talking. They felt like the house would be better structured if we came to some kind of formal arrangement. She had a document, One of those online legal templates you can pull off the internet for $14. It was a co-ownership agreement. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time because I wanted to make sure I understood what I was reading. They wanted me to sign over 50% ownership of the house to Joanna and by extension to Fletcher. In exchange, they would pay what they called a contribution to household expenses. The amount listed was $400 a month. The house was appraised at $340,000. I put the paper down and looked at my daughter. She was looking at the table. I said, "Joanna, this house is your inheritance. When I die, it comes to you. That has always been the plan." She said, "We just want security, Dad. You already live here for free." Fletcher walked in from the hallway then, which told me he'd been standing there listening. He sat down. He said, "Clive, we're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to formalize things. You're 63. Things happen. Joanna should have legal protection." I said, "She has a father who is 63 and in good health and who has a will that was drawn up by an actual attorney." Fletcher said, "Wills can be complicated." I said, "I need to think about this." He said, "I need to think about this." He said, "Take your time." But the way he said it didn't sound like he meant it. After that, things got cold. Not dramatic, not loud, just cold. The particular coldness of people who want something from you and are waiting for you to break down and give it to them. Fletcher stopped making eye contact at dinner. Joanna stopped asking how I was doing. I'd come home and the two of them would fall quiet, the way people do when they've been talking about you. I'd heat up soup on the stove while they watched television in the living room, and I thought about Margaret, and I thought about what she would have made of all this. Margaret was not a woman who tolerated being pushed around, not by anyone. She had a saying she used when people underestimated her: "You'll know I'm done when I stop speaking." She'd go quiet, then she'd act. I started going quiet. The Friday night when everything cracked open, I'd gotten home late from a doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, a follow-up on some blood work, and I walked in to find Fletcher on the phone in the kitchen, talking to someone. He didn't hear me come in. The back door makes no noise because I oiled the hinges every spring for 20 years. He was talking about the house. I stood in the mudroom and I listened. He was talking to someone about moving the timeline up. He said the old man was dragging his feet. He said once they had the title, they could refinance and pull equity. He mentioned a number, $220,000. He said, "She'll get him to sign. She always gets him to sign things eventually. He doesn't read the fine print." He laughed. I stood there for a long time after he hung up, long enough that my feet got cold on the tile. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and I thought about the fact that my daughter, had apparently tried this before. He doesn't read the fine print. What fine print? What had I already signed? I went to my filing cabinet. I went through everything. The car insurance renewal from March, the form about the internet service upgrade, the permission slip I'd signed because Fletcher said the HOA needed signature on record for their truck being parked in the driveway. The HOA form wasn't from the HOA. I looked up the address on the letterhead. It was a P.O. box in Nampa that didn't correspond to any homeowners association I could find. The form had language about shared use authorization for the property at my address. It wasn't legally binding. I had already quietly called an attorney friend by that point, but it showed me what they were doing. Testing. Probing. Seeing what I would sign without reading carefully. That night, I made 2 phone calls. The first call was to my attorney, Neil Braddock. I'd used Neil for my will and for some property issues back when a neighbor disputed the fence line in 2017. Neil is the kind of lawyer who doesn't talk more than necessary, which I appreciate. I told him what was happening. He told me what I needed to do. The second call was to my brother-in-law, Jerry, Margaret's brother, who lives in Twin Falls and who has never once pretended to like Fletcher. Jerry is 70, and he's been in real estate for 40 years. He knows things. I told Jerry I might need his help with something in about 3 weeks. He said, "Clive, I have been waiting for this call. Here is what most people don't understand about a situation like mine. The hardest part wasn't figuring out what to do. The hardest part was not letting on that I'd figured anything out at all. I went back to being the quiet old man in the house. I ate dinner when they ate dinner. I watched the news. I asked Fletcher about his job and nodded when he answered. I asked Joanna if she needed anything from the store. I let them think the clock was ticking in their favor. Fletcher brought up the co-ownership agreement again in mid-October. He was more direct this time. He said they'd been patient. They had their own financial goals, and they needed a decision. I said I was still thinking. He said, "Clive, this is getting a little ridiculous." I said I was sorry he felt that way. He went to the living room and turned the TV up loud. 3 days later, Joanna cried. She sat at the kitchen table and cried and told me she felt like I didn't trust her, like I was choosing property over my own daughter, like I didn't understand how hard their life was. She was a good crier. She always had been. When she was 8 years old, she could cry on command and get out of anything. I handed her a box of tissues, and I said, "Joanna, I love you. I'm not going to make a rushed decision about the house I've lived in for 30 years. Please understand that." She stopped crying pretty quickly after that. I want to be honest about something. There were moments during those weeks when I doubted myself, when I thought maybe I was being too suspicious. Maybe Fletcher really was just trying to plan for their future. Maybe Joanna really did just want security. Maybe I was a lonely old man reading too much into things. Then I remembered the phone call. She'll get him to sign. He doesn't read the fine print. I kept moving. The dinner was Jerry's idea, technically. I told him what I was planning, and he said, "You need witnesses, Clive, people who can look them in the eye." He offered to drive up from Twin Falls. I said, "Bring whoever you want." He said he'd bring his wife, Carol, and their son, Dale, who had recently gotten his law degree and passed the Idaho bar. I called 2 other people as well. My neighbor Hank Purcell, who was 81 years old and sharper than most 40-year-olds I know, and my old friend from the mill, Warren Sisk, who had been my supervisor for a decade and who Fletcher had once called that hick friend of your dad's at a 4th of July party when he thought I was out of earshot. I told Joanna and Fletcher I wanted to have a family dinner. I said I'd been doing a lot of thinking and I wanted to talk through the house situation with everyone together. I said I'd cook. Fletcher looked at Joanna. Joanna looked at Fletcher. I could see them calculating. Fletcher said, "Sure, Clive. That sounds good." I think he thought it meant I was going to sign. I cooked a pot roast, Margaret's recipe, the one that takes all day, with the carrots and the potatoes and the onions and the rosemary. I set the good table. I put out the cloth napkins that Margaret had embroidered herself. I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving since 2019. Fletcher and Joanna came downstairs dressed nicely. I remember Fletcher looking around at the table at the guests and something shifting in his face, something that was not quite confidence anymore. I introduced everyone. Dale, Jerry's son, shook Fletcher's hand and smiled. Fletcher asked if he was visiting. Dale said he was happy to be there. He didn't mention the bar exam. We sat down. We ate for 20 minutes. I asked Hank about his garden. Jerry told a story about a property deal in Twin Falls that had everyone laughing. Warren asked Fletcher about his work, and Fletcher answered. And for a little while he seemed to relax. Maybe he thought this was just dinner. Then I set down my fork. I said, "I want to thank everyone for coming. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about this house, about what I want the next chapter to look like, and I've made some decisions." Fletcher sat up a little straighter. I said, "First, I want to be clear about what this house is. It's paid for. It's in my name, and it's been my home for 30 years. No portion of it will be transferred to anyone while I'm alive." Joanna said, "Dad," I said, "let me finish, sweetheart." I took a document out of the folder I had placed under my chair before dinner. I slid one copy to Joanna and one to Fletcher. It was a letter from Neil Braddock's office. Formal, notarized, clearly worded. It outlined that following a review of property-related documents I had signed over the previous 18 months, I was placing formal notice that no signatures obtained outside of my attorney's office had any legal standing regarding property transfer, title modification, or shared use authorization. Fletcher read the top paragraph. His face went carefully blank. I said, "Fletcher, I also want you to know that I'm aware of the conversation you had on the phone in October, the one about the timeline, about refinancing, but the 220,000. The room got very quiet. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." I said, "You don't have to know. Neil knows. That's what matters." Joanna looked at her husband. It was the first time all evening she had looked at him that way. The way you look at someone when you're realizing something for the first time, or maybe admitting something you already knew. Jerry said from his end of the table very calmly, "The thing about family is that it runs in both directions." Nobody said anything for a moment. I said, "I'd also like to tell everyone that I've decided to list the house." Joanna said, "What?" I said, "I'm going to sell the house. I've already spoken with a realtor. Jerry has agreed to handle the listing. I'm going to move into the condo community over on Fairview, the 55+1 near the river. I've been to see it twice. It's quiet. I think Margaret would have liked it." Fletcher said, "Clive, you can't just." I said, "Fletcher, this is my house. I can do exactly this." I looked at my daughter then, not with anger. I want to be clear about that. I looked at her the way I used to look at her when she was small, and she had made a bad choice, and I needed her to understand something without me having to yell. I said, "Joanna, I love you. I will always love you. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. But I will not hand over the only thing she and I built together to a man who talked about me like I was an obstacle." Her eyes were wet, but she didn't say anything, and she didn't look at Fletcher. I want to tell you about what happened next, because people always want to know if it worked out. The house sold in 22 days. Good market that fall. I walked away with just over 300,000 after fees. I put a portion of it in a fund for Joanna, not for Fletcher, for Joanna, that she can access when she's ready. Neil structured it so Fletcher has no claim on it. Joanna called me 6 weeks after I moved into the condo. She wasn't crying this time. She was quiet. She said, "Dad, I need you to know I didn't understand how much he was driving things." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not sure what's going to happen with us." I said, "That's between you two." She said she missed me. I said I missed her too. I told her to come for dinner on Sunday if she wanted to. She came. She came alone. Fletcher, from what Jerry hears through the county records, has already moved in with someone in Meridian. He found new feet to land on. That's his nature. The condo is on the 2nd floor. There's a sliding door that opens to a little balcony, and in the mornings I can see the river from it if I lean over slightly to the left. I have my recliner. I have Margaret's photo on the wall. New frame, no cracked glass. Some evenings I sit on the balcony with bad coffee and I think about the dinner, about how quiet the room got, about Dale sitting there in his button-down shirt with his law degree fresh on the wall, just watching, about Jerry saying family runs in both directions in that measured voice of his, about Joanna looking at her husband and seeing him clearly, maybe for the first time. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't do anything in a rush or in anger. I waited until I had everything I needed, until the table was set right and the people I trusted were seated around it, until the moment was mine. Margaret had a second saying she used sometimes when things got hard. She'd look at me over the kitchen table, this kitchen table that I still have, that came with me to the condo, and she'd say, "Clive, still water does the deepest cutting." She was almost always right. I'm 63 years old. I live by a river. My daughter is finding her way back to me, and the house on Crescent Hill Road belongs to a young couple now, a teacher and an electrician, who I'm told have already started a garden in the backyard. I hope they take care of it. It's a good house. It deserves people who know what they have. I've had a lot of time to sit with all of this. That's one thing a balcony by the river gives you. Time. Time to go back over every moment and ask yourself whether you handled it right, whether you missed something, whether you could have done better. Mostly, I think I did okay. But here's what I know for certain now, at 63, that I wish I'd understood better at 40. The people who take advantage of you are almost never strangers. They're people you let inside, people you fed, people whose car you helped pay for when things got tight. Fletcher didn't walk in off the street and try to take my house. I opened the door. I converted the guest room. I moved my own belongings to the shed to make space for him. That's the part nobody tells you about, how the damage starts with your own generosity, when the other person has decided generosity is just a resource to be mined. That's not me feeling sorry for myself. That's just how it works. When you give without conditions, some people will keep taking until you set a limit. The limit is your job to set. Nobody else is going to do it for you. What I got wrong for a long time was thinking that patience meant waiting for someone to change. It doesn't. Patience is not passive. Real patience, the kind that actually means something, is what you use while you're preparing, while you're learning what you're dealing with, while you're getting your ducks in a row so that when you finally move, you move once and you move right. That's what those weeks of staying quiet were. Not weakness. Preparation. I think about Joanna a lot. I don't blame her entirely, and I don't excuse her entirely. She's my daughter, and I love her, and she let a man talk her into something she knew wasn't right. That's a thing that happens to smart people more often than they'd like to admit. The version of Joanna who came to the condo alone that Sunday, quiet and tired, that's the real one. I think she's going to be okay. I think she's already figuring out that some losses are actually corrections. The tricky thing about doing things the right way is that it doesn't feel dramatic while you're doing it. I wasn't running on anger that October. I was running on clarity. Clarity is quieter than anger, and it lasts longer, and it makes better decisions. Fletcher was counting on me to act like a wounded old man, to yell, to threaten, to do something he could point to. I didn't give him that. What I gave him instead was a dinner table full of people who knew exactly what he'd done, and a notarized letter, and a very calm voice. That's what intelligence looks like when it's not showing off. And here's the thing about integrity. It doesn't need an audience, but it does need to be exercised. Every time you choose the harder, slower, more careful path instead of the easy reaction, you're building something. You're building the kind of person who, when it matters most, knows what to do and does it without flinching. I am not a wise man in any grand sense. I ran quality control at a paper mill. I drank bad coffee and fished on weekends. But I paid attention. I watched what people did when they thought no one was looking. And I learned, slowly, over 63 years, that character is not what you claim to have. It's what you do when you're standing in the mudroom in the dark, listening to someone talk about you like you're an obstacle. What you do in that moment is who you are. I picked up my wife's photo off the floor. I called my lawyer. I cooked a pot roast, and I waited. Still water does the deepest cutting.